Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Bible study. Hope y'all are doing well. We're glad you're here. If you're joining us online, we want to welcome you also. We're glad you're part of our time today. So today we are going to look at Matthew 8. So if you have your copy of the New Testament, that's what we'll do. And I have put an outline together that I believe is going to help us finish. We're going to do Matthew this entire year. I think I've told y'all that. So I think what I put together will help us to make our way through Matthew by Advent. So that's our goal. It's a worthy goal because this is a huge book. So obviously these 5 sermons of Jesus serve as the framework of Matthew's gospel. And that connects Matthew's gospel to the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That's one of the reasons we know Matthew's gospel is thorough. It is a thoroughly Jewish document. He is using a lot of imagery for us. So you come to Matthew 8, and we now begin to get a more detailed take on what Jesus actually did. So I put that in your outline under word and deed. Another way we could have put that is the prophetic and priestly ministries of Jesus. He shares his messianic message in Matthew 5 through 7. Obviously, he's going to do that in these other sermons as well. But beginning in Matthew 8, his messianic mission is on display through the miracles he's going to perform and the description of life among his disciples, a challenging message from Jesus. So with that said, just a brief word about the miracles of Jesus. You know, the miracles of Jesus have puzzled scholars for centuries. How did he do these things? Why did he do them? Some of y'all may be familiar with, Thomas Jefferson didn't believe in miracles. So Thomas Jefferson actually published his own version of the New Testament, and he pulled all the miracles out because he just couldn't get his mind. He was a very, if y'all know anything about Jefferson, he was an incredibly rational thinker, heavily steeped in philosophy, and he just had a hard time reconciling how Jesus could engage in these miraculous acts. So he just pulled them out of the New Testament. Lots of scholars have struggled with them, but what I would say is, what's really happening, in the way I look at the miracles of Jesus, is that he's intervening into the brokenness of this world. And so he's pushing back the forces of nature and evil, excuse me, as I say in this outline, through the display of power. And his miracles are categorized usually in these 4 different categories. They're healings, exorcisms, raising the dead, and power over nature. And to me, they give evidence of the fact that Jesus is establishing the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, as Matthew would call it, on earth. Now, lots of things to consider when you talk about the miracles of Jesus. Why did he do the ones he did and not do other ones? Did Jesus heal everybody that he came in contact with? Well, the answer to that is no. And so we have to just trust his will, his intentionality, why he chose to do what he did. It appears to me that he's offering us glimpses of the kingdom. And so when he does perform a miracle, it's almost as if Jesus will say, no, not this one. Not every leper was cleansed, but this one was. Not every person was raised from the dead, but occasionally this one was. It's almost like Jesus was saying no or not yet. So when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead, when Jesus will raise Lazarus from the dead, both of them will, the widow of Nain's son, all of them will go on and die later, right? They weren't resurrected from the dead to never die again. They were raised from the dead, and then they will eventually die again. And so it's almost as if Jesus will say, no, just not yet. So there are these powerful examples of Jesus giving us a glimpse of the kingdom actually being established on this earth and how ultimately it's going to be one day. Perhaps that will help us. Also, I would say the miracles of Jesus are attestations of his messianic power and presence. And so the display of power attests to who he is, that he is different than the rest of the prophets. There is no one like him, and he's able to do things that no one else could do. And it's an interesting read whenever you see what he chooses to do and how he chooses to exert that power. So Michael Wilkins, in his commentary on Matthew, he says what he loves about the first part of Matthew 8 is that Jesus steps into the margins of society and offers us an example to follow. And so he refers to that first section as healing the marginalized. So I like that. I just wanted to put that in front of y'all because I think he's got great insight. He's written a commentary on Matthew. So let's just look at those. Here's the first one. There's the boundary of purity where Jesus will cleanse a leper. Look at chapter 8, verse 1. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy, and then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Well, typically in the New Testament, when someone is healed of leprosy, the word cleansed is used. And you'll find that here. This man asked to be cleansed because a leper was unclean. And that was a word that was used by lepers. Leprosy was, today, leprosy is an actual medical condition that is somewhat limiting, if you will, and narrow in its definition. That would have not been true in the first century. Leprosy covered all kinds of skin maladies. There was just a lot of confusion about it, and priests were the ones who were supposed to inspect you to determine whether you were contagious or not. And if that decision was made, then you spent the rest of your life outside the camp of Israel. And you had to wear certain clothes, and you had to always announce yourself. And the word you used to announce yourself was the word unclean. And so it was their life desire to be clean again, if that makes sense. And so that's what he asks for. Can you just cleanse me? And so Jesus is someone who understands the laws of purity. If you'll notice, he tells the guy, go and show yourself to the priest. In other words, go ahead and do what the law commands someone to do if they're purified. But he does something incredibly unconventional in verse 3, because there were a lot of things that you would do to a leper. There was one thing you would never do: touch them. And Jesus touched him. I love that because I wonder how long it had been since this man had been touched. No one would have anything to do with him. And isn't it fascinating that every time Jesus touched someone, rather than him becoming impure, he imparted purity. And so it says something again about the messianic identity of Jesus, that he is unlike anyone else. And so he cleanses this man, but then he tells the man, I want you to go ahead and abide by what Moses said to do, so go do it. But then you have that interesting little phrase that we find several times in the Gospels, find it in Matthew and Mark and others: don't tell anybody who I am. And we think, as best we can tell, the reason for that is Jesus realized that there's such an attraction to miracles. And at this point, no one really knows who Jesus is. And so whatever they share about him is going to be incredibly limited. And if it becomes totally focused on miracles, then that's all people will want from him. And he's just not ready for that to happen. And so he just says, don't spread this, but at least go and let the priest know. Then you have a really fascinating story starting in verse 5, where Michael Wilkins says, here's where these ethnic boundaries are addressed. We have evidence in Capernaum. If you look at verse 5, it says Jesus entered Capernaum. We think Jesus moved to Capernaum as an adult, lived there, and that's where Peter and Andrew were living. I've been to Capernaum, and you can actually go visit what we believe is Simon Peter's home. There's a church that was established there during the 4th century. And what's fascinating is there's a synagogue there that was built in the 4th century, and they have actually done some research on it and scraped it back to the 1st century. And so you can actually go stand on the steps of the synagogue there in Capernaum where Jesus used to teach. It's really very sobering kind of reality. But there's enough evidence now, the research shows us that this house that they've uncovered, one of the reasons they believe it's Simon Peter's house is because you have ancient graffiti written on the walls of it. So in other words, pilgrims came and visited there in the early 200s and 300s and carved Peter's name into the walls of the house to basically let everybody know, we believe this is where Simon Peter lived. They also have discovered there is some type of a Roman garrison on the east side of the city of Capernaum, which meant there were Roman soldiers who were living there. Well, if there were enough Roman soldiers living there, then you had to have a centurion who would be over that small group of soldiers, about 100 or so, okay? So you've got a synagogue in Capernaum, you got Simon Peter's house in Capernaum, and you've got a Roman garrison in Capernaum, okay? So when you get to verse 5, Jesus enters Capernaum, and the centurion, the guy that's in charge of this small group of Roman soldiers, came to Jesus asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. And Jesus said, isn't this fascinating, to a pagan Gentile, you want me to just come heal him? Isn't that fascinating? And the centurion replied, Lord, I don't deserve to have you come under my roof. This centurion evidently had lived in Capernaum long enough to know that Jews could not enter a Gentile's home. That would then cause the Jew to be unclean. And so he says, you don't have to do that. Just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. So let me just stop and ask y'all, when was the last time Jesus was amazed by you? I don't know about y'all, but I think it's pretty hard to amaze Jesus, because he's seen quite a bit. Wouldn't you agree? I love that. Jesus was actually amazed. We'll just kind of let that one sit a little bit for us. So he said to those following him, I tell you, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west. There's the statement about the Gentiles. And will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. So you got this very intimate exchange between Jesus and a leper, where Jesus touches him. And then you have this other healing incident where Jesus doesn't even show up. He doesn't even go to the house. He doesn't even meet the guy. He just speaks it, and it happens. Once again, Matthew's, we don't necessarily think at this point Matthew's being chronologically concerned. Matthew's being theologically concerned. He's helping us understand the messianic role of Jesus. So, but the point is, Jesus sees the faith of this Roman soldier, this Gentile, and heals his servant. So there's the inclusive nature of the mission of Jesus, the light of the gospel going to the Gentiles. There's also a prophetic word from Jesus in this text, where he says in verse 12, there will be Jews who will miss out on this. The actual members of the kingdom are going to be cast out, and they're going to be replaced by the outsiders, the marginalized, the Gentiles. Would have been very puzzling to the Jews of the first century. The fact that Jesus, first of all, would even engage in this kind of a conversation with a pagan and then healed his servant, and then turned around and said, there'll be some of y'all who won't be invited, but some of them will be. So we're getting a glimpse of the universal nature of the messianic ministry and mission of Jesus. And I'm grateful for it, because I don't know about you, but I'm a Gentile. So I'm grateful that this messianic mission included people like me, who's been invited in from the east and the west to be in on, actually I'm from the south, but you know what I mean, the east and the west, to be brought in to this family. And then Matthew's not done, because there are other boundaries. There are other marginalized people in the ancient world, particularly in the Jewish world in the first century. If you look at verse 14, when Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. Now, in the first century, people didn't necessarily see a fever as a symptom of a disease. The fever was the disease itself. In other words, there wasn't enough technology yet and knowledge for them to understand that this was the body's natural reaction to something. This was the actual disease itself. And notice, once again, the intimacy of this, verse 15. He touched her, and the fever left her, and she got up and started cooking supper, which I love that, you know. Well, think about it, though. When she's living there with Peter and his wife, and Jesus is coming to visit, now naturally, what do you think she wants to do? If Jesus is coming to visit her home, I mean, come on, y'all. She's going to cook and clean, and I mean, she's a Jewish woman in the first century. She's the hospitable hostess. And there she is with a fever. And so soon as Jesus healed her, the first thing she does is she goes right to do what she wanted to do in the first place. And it's a beautiful restoration ministry of Jesus. But there's a gender boundary. We have the healing of a woman also mentioned in this account. Again, I think Matthew is letting us know that this Messiah is for everybody. That shouldn't surprise us if we read page 1. Remember? Because in page 1 of Matthew's gospel, you have all these women listed in the genealogy, even Gentiles. Remember? And so Matthew's sending us a signal, and now it's almost like he's asking us, y'all do remember that women and Gentiles were included in the genealogy. Well, I'm actually showing you how they were included in the ministry as well, the very mission of Jesus, that the marginalized in the first century are brought into this family, into this new kingdom, if you will. And then, starting in verse 16, at the end of the day, the people have come in from the fields, and folks have recognized Jesus is there, and you know the word about Jesus is starting to spread, whether he wants it to or not. Don't you wish that were still true? The word about Jesus was spreading whether he wanted to or not. Because I've heard one preacher say that Jesus kept telling these people to go and tell nobody, and they went and told everybody. And he tells us to go and tell everybody, and we tell nobody. So it's amazing what happened during Jesus' lifetime. So people just started bringing folks to him, whether they were demon-possessed, they were sick, or whatever it was, because they felt like something could happen if they showed up with the people they loved who were infirmed. And so notice what Matthew says. Matthew says this whole ministry is connected to what God said was going to happen. He says in verse 17, it was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities. He bore our diseases. So Matthew is speaking theologically and connecting Jesus to the entire understanding of salvation history. We talked about that Sunday morning. The Palm Sunday is a moment in salvation history. So Jesus is, his mission is the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on this earth. And it's on full display. Now, he's going to do more than that. He's actually going to challenge those who came to him to help them better understand what it actually means to be a disciple. So if you look at verse 18, Matthew says, well, when Jesus saw the crowd, he gave orders to cross over the other side of the lake. And a teacher of the law came to him and said, I will follow you wherever you go. And then Jesus said, do you really mean that? Because, look at verse 20, foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Now the reason Jesus said that, I believe, directly to this guy is there were people in those days who would go attach themselves to a rabbi. And typically the rabbi had some kind of location where he worked, and he had a school, if you will, that gathered around him, and there was provision for him. And so presumably you would think, well, okay, well then Jesus he must have a school. This is a place where I can go and live and be housed, and I can attend seminary, basically, with him. And Jesus said, well, let me just tell you something before you join my group. I have no place to live. I have no school. I have no established. Matter of fact, I don't have a place to lay my own head. So if you're going to follow me, you need to give some real thought to it, because it may not be exactly what you think it's going to be. It's going to be something that's going to require complete surrender. So it was a pretty challenging word to a potential seminary student. Does that make sense? This guy seems to be genuine, but he's got in his mind what it's supposed to look like. And Jesus says, before you join, let me help you understand how it really is. Then another disciple, verse 21, said, Lord, let me go bury my father. Now that sounds like an innocent request. And Jesus said, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. What a compassionate, sweet word from Jesus. Well, most scholars believe that this phrase that is used by people in those days, let me go bury my father, it didn't mean necessarily that their father had died. It meant let me stay and fulfill all of my family obligations, and then when all that's over, then one day I'll come follow you. Does that make sense? And Jesus said, if you want to follow me, I'm on earth right now. So in the first century, if you wanted to follow Jesus, that meant you went and followed him, right? So he said, if you want to be in on this right now, you're not going to be able to wait and fulfill all those kind of obligations. You're just going to go ahead and come on right now. And let the dead bury the dead. Let that happen as it needs to happen. So it wasn't necessarily a dispassionate, uncompassionate word from Jesus. I think it was more of a message about commitment and surrender. Are you really going to do this or not? If you're going to do it, go ahead and do it. And he had examples right there he could have pointed to Peter and Andrew and James and John, because you remember they're going to say to Jesus, we left everything to follow you. And Jesus is going to tell them, I know that. And if you chose to do this, you're going to be rewarded for it. But the point is, he's calling for complete commitment. And whether you're ready to do that or not would dictate on the decision you would make. Now, remember who's writing this. Okay? Matthew. And you remember what happened to Matthew. Jesus, presumably, Matthew saw Jesus, was familiar with his ministry, had a little bit of connection with Jesus, and then finally one day Jesus stopped at his business and said, why don't you leave all that and come follow me? Remember what Matthew did? Okay, I'll do it. So Matthew's writing this, so there's a little bit of testimony, I'm sure, coming out here because he did that. Rather than saying to Jesus, well, actually what I've got to do is maintain all my family obligations. No, Matthew said, okay. And he left everything and followed Jesus. So Matthew, I believe there's a sense of his connection to people like this because he knew what that meant. Then you have two very famous stories to fill out the rest of chapter 8. Verse 23. So Jesus got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Now some of y'all have been to Israel. You know, Galilee kind of sits down in a little bowl and is surrounded by these, that they call them mountains. I don't know that, well, if you're in Texas, you'd probably call them a mountain, but you know, more hill. Well, I mean that respectfully. You know, I mean, I grew up in Alabama. I remember the first time I ever saw the Rocky Mountains. I was a grown man. I'd seen the Smoky Mountains, you know, growing up in Tennessee. Well, I saw the Rocky Mountains. I was like, whoa. You know, those are like real mountains, you know. They don't have trees on them, you know. And so, well, there's mountains, hills, whatever you want to call it, surrounding the Sea of Galilee. So it is in a bowl. And so the wind comes in from the east, and when it does, it just stirs the lake up, if you will, almost like you're out in the ocean. I mean, that's why you'd wonder, why are there so many waves in a lake? You know, well, that's because the way it's situated geographically, it can get stirred up just like you were in a storm in the ocean. And remember, when things like this happen, Jesus is not in a boat with a bunch of novices. You know, he's not in there with people like me. Y'all know how I feel about boats and Titanic and cruises. Y'all can have all of that. I want none of it. Anyway, I'm a land person. Well, these are seasoned fishermen. They're not, and they've lived their whole lives on the Sea of Galilee. So they think they hadn't seen a storm in their life. Well, of course they have. But this time, verse 24, a furious storm came up on the lake. The waves swept over the boat. And I love this. Jesus is asleep, which is, I mean, some people can sleep through sermons. Some people can sleep through storms. I mean, some people are just good at sleeping, you know. So he's asleep. And so disciples woke him up. And I love their statement to him. They said, Lord, we're about to drown. I mean, again, these are seasoned veterans. They're not novices on this lake. We're about to drown. He says, you have little faith. Why are you so afraid? He got up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was completely calm. Then, verse 27, thaumazo, the people were amazed. And then they said, What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. So they went from being incredibly scared to being overwhelmingly shocked because they had never seen this happen before. Once again, Matthew is letting us know that this Messiah is powerful, and even nature obeys him. So we've got miracles of healing. We've got miracles eventually that we'll see in this gospel story about raising people from the dead. We've got a nature miracle. Then look at the next one, verse 28. When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, there were 2 demon-possessed men. Now remember, Matthew's an eyewitness, okay? And so we have other accounts of this. And Mark's gospel, he tells us about one of these men. Matthew comments there were actually 2 of them. They were coming from the tombs, which tells you something about them because no self-respecting Jew would live anywhere near a burial ground. Because just like being a leper would have made you unclean, having anything to do with dead bodies and being connected to them would make you unclean as well. So these are demon-possessed men. They were so violent no one could even pass that way. Verse 29, "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" How about that? These demons think we have more time here. It's not time yet, is it, for this whole thing to be over? So they have a little bit of eschatology. Somehow they realize their days are limited, so they're going to do as much damage as they can. And so verse 30, some distance from them, there was a large herd of pigs feeding. Now what does that tell me about where we are? We're in Gentile territory because the last thing you would have found in southern Israel would have been a herd of pigs, you know. We're in the Gentile area. We're on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and the Decapolis and the Gentile territory. So the demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out." Isn't it funny? They already knew he was going to cast them out of these men. They already had that figured out. So in other words, the torment and the destruction they were causing was about to end. So they said, "Would you just send us over into the herd of pigs?" He said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into the town and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. When the whole town went out to meet Jesus, when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. Well, once again, here's an incredible display of power. The identity of the Son of Man is at stake, and he is now demonstrating his power over the forces of evil. We have a little taste of that in verse 16, where it says he drove out the spirits. But here's a very solid example of Jesus casting demons out of demon-possessed people. Sending the demons into these pigs causes the pigs to go into a frenzy. The pigs drown, then presumably the demons leave them and they go looking for their next victim. That's kind of what's happening here. Because Jesus doesn't necessarily undo all the demonic forces at work in this world. They are still at work in this world. Just occasionally he will cast them out of some people. This is one of those examples. Now what's fascinating is the people in the town were more concerned with pigs than with people. So just think about that. In other words, you got human beings who are suffering, and they knew that, and there was nothing they could do about it. So what they did was they just left them alone because they wouldn't even go near them. And they knew how tormented these people were. And we're not sure who they were, but they presumably were boys from this town. And so I'm just assuming their parents probably still lived in this town, and nobody knew what to do with these boys, and they were so tormented, and everybody knew who they were. And Jesus heals them, and now they're upset about the pigs, which is fascinating to me. We could have a long discussion about that, but I would tell you that it may not be polite to say it, but I would say we still have some of that around today. People are more concerned about fill in the blank than they are people. Whereas the gospel is about people. The gospel is about transforming people's lives, about bringing healing and restoration. So everywhere Jesus goes, people get better. Everywhere he goes, he has a healing touch. He has a restorative power. He has prophetic pronouncements, and you can either choose to receive those prophetic pronouncements and you will be transformed and get better, or you can reject them and you will experience the reality of rejecting what Jesus has offered you. That's what he says in his prophetic ministry when he says there are people in our own family who are going to be cast out of the kingdom. Others are going to be brought in that may surprise you. Jesus is going to perform miracles that are going to, once again, demonstrate his identity and the nature of his messianic mission. He's going to always stretch people to think beyond what they're comfortable thinking. That's just the way Jesus worked. And he's going to challenge us to believe in the holistic nature of his mission. I believe that the ministry of healing is still incredibly important today, that Jesus is still the great physician. You know, we still pray for sick people to get well, because we believe that Jesus brings healing to people, and he can do that however he chooses. There are, obviously, I believe in medicine and technology. I believe it's a gift from God, but I also believe in the power of prayer. And so in my office, I always have some anointing oil. I have people that come by my office and ask me to anoint them with oil and pray healing over them. And I do that because I believe in the power of healing. I've also had just a couple of instances in my life where we've dealt with demon-possessed people. It's never comfortable. It's always challenging. It's happened in my office before. It's happened in a couple of times when I've been on the mission field where I believe people have been possessed by demons. And it's uncomfortable, but it's just a reminder of the reality of the spiritual forces that you and I so often grow numb to in our highly technological society. You know, we wander around the American culture as if this is the only force at work, as if this world was all there is, when there is an entire force that's taking place across God's creation, where there are demonic forces and powers of evil, regardless of whether we want to acknowledge them or not. But there just are, and I believe in them, and I believe people are possessed by demons, and I believe Jesus is the answer. And those demons can be cast out, just like I believe people can be healed. That's why we still pray for healing. The messianic mission of Jesus hasn't changed. It's restorative, it's transformative, it's redemptive, it's extending the kingdom of heaven in this day and in every day. And the church is here as a colony of heaven on earth to be a place of healing and transformation. Healing takes on so many different forms. Sometimes it's way more than physical. I think I've shared this with y'all. One of the more poignant scenes to me in the series The Chosen is when Jesus is talking to James the Less. You know, we don't really know what the scripture means when it calls James the Less. You know, you have James, who's the brother of John, and then you've got James the Less. And, some people think it means he was small in stature. Some people think it means he was younger. We're not really sure. But Dallas Jenkins has chosen to cast a character to play James the Less who has cerebral palsy. And his cerebral palsy has caused his body to be a little bit contorted, and he's small in stature. And he's actually the son of the mayor of Arlington. It's Jim Ross's son, who's the actual actor that plays James the Less. Well, if y'all have seen the scene where Jesus is commissioning the disciples in The Chosen to go out and heal, and he gives them the power and the authority to heal, there's a poignant scene where that actor, like I said, who has cerebral palsy, whose body is obviously contorted, a little small of stature, says to Jesus, "So what about me? So you're going to send me out to heal. Why don't you heal me?" And Jesus puts his hands on his shoulders and says, "I already have, James. I've already healed you." In other words, the healing I've given you is much deeper and richer than just this physical healing. I'm giving you something incredibly powerful that you're going to be shared with others. So it's a theological interpretation from Dallas Jenkins that the healing of Jesus is more than just physical healing. James has already been healed on the inside for eternity, which is what really matters. So the healing ministry of Jesus, the power of Jesus that was on display in the New Testament era, I realize that was a moment in time. But I don't want to sell his power short in our time either, that we still depend on him to do things that only he can do. So I still believe in miracles. And if I didn't, y'all ought to get rid of me. You shouldn't have a preacher that doesn't believe in miracles, because we're followers of Jesus. And so however he chooses to intervene, and extend the kingdom of God, I trust him to do that. And there's no harm in asking, in my opinion. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop right there. Those of you who join us online, thank you, and happy Holy Wednesday, happy Easter, and we'll see you next week.